classified as a neurohormone similar to ADH or oxytocin. Its structure is actually made by neurons. And interestingly, this group of neurons migrates from the nose to the hypothalamus. So there are some individuals whose development immunologically that affects that area are lacking these hormones. And of course, they're going to be infertile because of that close relationship between the nose and these components. Also, you can see the relationship between pheromones and sexual activity. Been well known now that women in close quarters in the dormitory, roommates, end up having their cycles together, and that's thought to be an aspect of pheromones and the relationship between smell and these components of the hypothalamus. So GnRH then passes into the passes into the first capillary bed. So cap bed 1. And from cap bed 1 passes into the anterior pituitary via vessels observed as the portals. And from there, the circles are capillaries. Pass into the anterior pituitary from cap bed 2. GnRH is a glycoprotein. Right? Small protein. Small peptide, which is less than 200, it's about 60 amino acids in length. And so it's too large, obviously, to bind within the cell, to pass through the plasma membrane and bind within the cell. So on the cells of the anterior pituitary, it's going to bind to a plasma membrane G protein pathway. As such, it's going to regulate the production of two hormones, FSH and LH. Now, we're not going to get into the reproductive physiology components quite as much, but this is required in a pulsatile. GnRH is released in a cyclic form rather than a constant level. And in males, it's a constant cycle. Whereas in females, the time between the pulses varies. All right, so it's a cyclic form, up and down, high amounts, low amounts. In the male, it's a pretty steady cycle, whereas in females, the cycles come more frequently depending on the stage of the monthly cycle, menstrual cycle. And whether it's FSH or low H also varies. So low cycle frequency will produce one hormone. The closer the cycles are together, the other hormone is produced. And again, that's more important in the female with the different effects of FSH and LH on the follicular cells and on the cells surrounding the follicles. Yes?
It's maybe a little off, but is that kind of what creates like a male menstrual, not menstrual, but like PMS type cycle?
Yeah, but they're more variable. All right, so now let's look at the effects of these two sets of molecules. You have another diagram. I don't know if you have this one in your lecture notes, but there is another one, this one, that is maybe a little easier to look at because it shows the actual cells. 62. But this is the more accurate one here, so I'm going to diagram that as we go. And what I'm referring to, and I'll emphasize it again, is the negative feedback aspect. So on this diagram, you can see that GnRH is causing the release of LH and FSH. Okay? And then LH and FSH result, especially LH, in the production of testosterone. Testosterone has a negative feedback on both the anterior pituitary directly and on the hypothalamus. So as LH is being produced by the Leydig cells, and not produced by, but binding to the Leydig cells, and they produce testosterone. Testosterone is going to have a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary as testosterone levels rise. So it's going to have a negative feedback, an inhibitory feedback. And it is going to have a negative feedback on the release of GnRH. So it will decrease, testosterone will decrease both elevated levels of testosterone, will result in a decrease directly, put that word in here, of GnRH, and a direct decrease on the pituitary of LH. Obviously, GnRH lowering is going to lower LH as well. But this is going to have, it works on both organs. Okay? So it works directly on the hypothalamus. And it works directly on the anterior pituitary. Negative feedback of FSH, which goes to the Sertoli cells, it produces a molecule known as inhibin. Let me write that in a different color so you guys can follow that through a little bit more clearly. This? That I can't move. I'll write it over here again. So FSH binds to the Sertoli cells in the testes. And Sertoli cells, as a result, produce a hormone known as inhibin. Inhibin, you can see it here, right? Inhibin works only on the anterior pituitary. So inhibin is going to the anterior pituitary and have a negative feedback. And I mention that specifically because in this diagram, inhibin is shown going to the hypothalamus. I want you to make a correction if you have this copy of the illustration. Take testosterone, because I sometimes use this in the extra credit on the exams.
Hint, hint.
So
Over here.
testosterone.
Oh, no.
Do you have it on the lecture notes or just in the PowerPoint? Okay, so it's on the lecture notes on page 62. Take testosterone and draw a line to both anterior pituitary and to the hypothalamus. Right? And then from inhibin, it goes only to anterior pituitary. Cross out the line going to the hypothalamus. Okay. So what I want you to do is, I don't know where to write on this board. So we have anterior, we have hypothalamus. And anterior pituitary. Testosterone. Produces a negative feedback on both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Okay, everybody with me on that one?
So that means it decreases the GnRH.
Right. So less GnRH is produced and less LH is produced. are the result of rising levels of testosterone. And then inhibin goes only to the anterior pituitary. So rising levels of testosterone, IT, is going to equal decreased GnRH and decreased LH. Whereas rising levels of inhibin is going to equal decreased levels of FSH. FSH, not directed. Inhibin, not directed.
This one?
Pardon?
It's where,
The testosterone goes up. Okay, so it's back to that seesaw effect. All right? So, rather than trying to go by the screen, put the screen up. So we have, if we look at just LH first, okay? So for testosterone synthesis, we'll focus on this first. For testosterone synthesis, the steps that occur, hypothalamic nuclei release GnRH. GnRH via the portal system binds to G protein coupled plasma membrane receptors. Of anterior pituitary gonadotropes. Those are cells that synthesize LH and FSH. Since we're following the testosterone pathway, we're going to be interested at this point in LH. Okay? So this is a phospholipase C giving rise to IP3 and DAG pathway. And LH levels increase, so they're synthesized and released into the blood. And they bind to LH receptors on the interstitial or Leydig cells. In the testes. Remember where those are located? We have our microscopic view of seminiferous tubules, and outside of these We have the Leydig cells. Okay. So they will have receptors on their plasma membrane that bind LH. And this is a cyclic AMP pathway. So the alpha subunit is going to activate adenylate cyclase. And that's going to take ATP and form cyclic AMP. And then increasing levels of cyclic AMP, as you recall, is going to result in active protein kinase. And that's going to phosphorylate additional enzymes. Okay, so this is all happening inside the Leydig cell. So in this production, the Leydig cells are producing testosterone. What is our classification of testosterone? Steroid. Steroids are derived from arachidonic acid or cholesterol. Cholesterol. All right. So what happens as a result within the interstitial cell or the Leydig cell is the cell increases its uptake of cholesterol. And in the cell, various components, mitochondria and cytoplasmic enzymes, are going to take cholesterol and convert it to, in a series of steps. Pregnenolone, other molecules, but what I want you to recognize is one called androstenedione. Yes?
That cell, the Leydig cells,
Uh-huh.
are taking cholesterol from outside
From the
cells,
blood,
from the
LDL
blood,
molecules.
and are they making adrenals?
Right, so they have enzymes. So what's happening is the cyclic AMP is activating the enzymes involved in this process. Okay? So there are enzymes required here that are activated by the cyclic AMP. I'm not going to go into the detail, but there's also effects on the DNA, and new proteins are even produced because of elevated levels of cyclic AMP and even calcium. So then androstenedione is converted to testosterone. Now we're going to come back to this sequence next week, because, probably Thursday, because in the female, these same steps occur. Your ovaries, the follicular cells in the ovary, actually the theca interna cells in the ovaries, are making androstenedione and testosterone. Okay, but then we take that testosterone and convert it further to estrogens. The testes make estrogens, all right, but the degree, the volume is reversed. So that if the cells in the testes make a lot of testosterone, the cells in the ovaries make a lot of estrogen. In the male, there's a little bit of estrogen, and in the female, there's a little bit of testosterone. So now testosterone is it's still a lipid-soluble molecule based on a cholesterol component. And so it now is going to be lipid-soluble and pass out of the Leydig cell. About 10% of it will get into the blood and travel to other tissues, muscle, bone, hair follicles, liver, all right, and affect those components. 90% of them are going to go and affect the Sertoli cell, the sustentacular cell. And you'll remember the sustentacular cell because it is the site of our developing sperm cells. So with outside of the cell here, we have the spermatogonia. And then we have all the other developing stages. And I'm not going to go show the complete connection of the plasma membranes, but remember they're surrounded by the plasma membrane. They're not in the actual contact with the cytoplasm. So these are developing spermatocytes. So the role of testosterone, the spermatocytes themselves don't have receptors for testosterone. All right, so the spermatogonia, the primary spermatocytes, the spermatids don't have receptors for testosterone, but the Sertoli or sustentacular cells do. Where would that receptor be located? On the plasma membrane or inside the sustentacular cell? Inside the cell. Good. So these are known as androgen receptors because various forms of testosterone are known as androgens. You might in your reading see AR abbreviated, but they are binding testosterone. And then from there, they will move to the nucleus of the sustentacular cell and affect DNA transcription. There's a whole bunch of other things that they do that don't require moving to the nucleus. So they'll affect calcium levels and a bunch of other enzymes that are activated that we're not going to go through all those molecular biology steps. So now what is their role? Okay. Their role is to, along with chemicals made by the sustentacular cell, influence the development of the sperm. So let's pause there. I'm going to leave that